Hi friends, today we're going to discuss A Literature of Their Own by Elaine Showalter. The first volume of this book was published in 1977, swiftly laid the groundwork for the feminist literary studies movement that would later revolutionize the subject. Showalter, one of the pioneers of feminist criticism in US, coined the word Gynocriticism to describe criticism that concentrated on literature published by women. By collecting and re-evaluating lost or forgotten literary works by women, this critique questioned the typically male-dominated literary canon. In A Literature of Their Own, Showalter demonstrates how readers and academics might reclaim a lost female literary legacy by exploring the wealth of female authors outside of George Eliot and Jane Austen. She maintained that patriarchal notions of what was significant had rendered this female literary legacy invisible. This text studies the processes by which female writers produced a literature of their own and built a canon of works by women that reflected a developing female awareness. A Literature of Their Own is a text which helped spark an intellectual ferment that tried to establish gender as a category of analysis by opening up a significant new arena of literary research and changing the English literary canon. This book is a classic of feminist criticism, is still relevant today, even though the results of its groundbreaking work now have the luxury of being taken for granted. This text by Showalter was first released in 1977 and later was expanded in 1999 with an introduction titled 20 Years On, A Literature of Their Own, Revisited. For female critics, this work is a groundbreaking masterpiece. In the introduction, she writes that in the map of the English novel, women's land is frequently shown as a desert bordered by mountains on four sides: the Austen Peaks, the Bronte Cliffs, the Eliot Range, and the Wolf Hills. The text fills in the gaps between these literary monuments to create a more trustworthy map from which to examine the accomplishments of English women novelists. By describing the details and conditions of its authors' careers and personal lives, the book that follows wonderfully carries out this strategy. Additionally, it lists and categorizes many lesser known authors who were all well known at the time but are now lost to history. This survey provides a brief social history of middle-class England in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. John Stuart Mill's statement from 1869, "If women lived in a distant nation from men and had never read any of their publications," is the source of her title. According to Showalter, women gradually became more conscious of their differences and expressed that awareness via their art. A Literature of Their Own aims to document the development of a collective self-consciousness and the history of a unique literary subculture. Showalter argues that all literary subcultures can be traced through three major phases. The first one, a phase of imitation and internalization, in which the subculture largely adopts the values and literary forms of the dominant tradition. A phase that here extends from the widespread appearance of the male pseudonym in the 1840s to George Eliot's death in 1880. Second, a phase of advocacy and protest in which subcultures begin to declare its independence and rejects prevailing values. Showalter associates this stage with the years between 1880 and the 1920 presidential election, and third, a stage of self-discovery. that begins around 1920 and lasts until the present. Showalter's model suggests that the female writing tradition is now approaching its maturity after surviving the culture equivalent of childhood and adolescence. She refers to these development phases as feminine, feminist, and female. These questionable names have sparkled a lively debate among detractors. Feminine is a word difficult to identify with the tremendous achievement of the Brontes, George Eliot, and Mrs. Gaskell, asserts Ruth Yeazel. Even though the academic meanings of these words are unclear, they will never diminish the worth of this work. Showalter gives us a thoughtful and comprehensive family history rather than a single life history of British female authors. One of the thrills of reading this text is discovering long forgotten relatives and tracing lost lines of ancestry and heritage. Showalter argues that one reason we haven't noticed these relationships before is that we have insisted on focusing on the exceptional few, like George Eliot and Virginia Woolf. Showalter unearths from us many of the less notable figures, including suffragists and radicals like Elizabeth Robbins and Dora Madison, sensation novelists like Mary Braddon and Rhoda Broughton, feminists like Oliver and Sarah Grant, and feminists like Oliver Schreiner and Sarah Grant. Now, concentrating on Showalter's introduction of 1999, I have framed it in a form of an imagined interview with Showalter to make it a little clearer. You will surely be able to understand the work better and simpler as a result of this. So let's begin with the first question of the interview to Showalter. So what exactly is this journey you have been on, which most likely started with your PhD thesis to think about literary critique and would make a significant contribution to the history of women's writing? Showalter: in 1965, when I began to do research for my PhD dissertation on Victorian women writers, feminist criticism did not exist. Virginia Woolf's letters and diaries were scattered and unpublished. Scholars still call Elizabeth Gaskell Mrs. and Frances Burney Fanny. No one edited women's study journals or compiled bibliographies of women's writing. Professional opportunities for academic women seemed so limited in the mid-1960s that I felt paradoxically freed to write about the books I liked rather than the ones most likely to get me a job. As the issue of my work and my life took on new meaning in the light of feminism, I began to envisage a much bolder critical undertaking that my thesis, and to imagine a literary criticism that would do for the history of women's writing what Northrop Frye had done for Canadian literature, or even what Perry Miller and F.O. Matheson had done for American literature. The second question would be that what is the origin of this female literary tradition, if there is one? Showalter: I set myself the task of filling in the gaps between Austen and Lessing by reading as many novels by English women as I could find and trying to understand the ways they related to each other. If there was a female literary tradition, I was sure it came from imitation, literary convention, the marketplace, and critical reception, not from biology or psychology. The next question would be, what were the foundational tenets of your theory and how did you arrive at it? Showalter: my theoretical assumptions came from the sociology and ethnography of literature, looking at such a literary subculture as African American writing, Canadian writing, and Anglo-Indian writing. I attempted to define women's writing as the product of a subculture, evolving with relation to a dominant mainstream. In its evolution, I argued women's writing moves in the direction of an all-inclusive female realism, a broad, socially informed exploration of the daily lives and values of women within the family and the community. But a mature women's literature ceases to be part of a subculture and can move into a seamless participation in the literary mainstream. From this journey towards a literature of your own, what conclusions have you drawn? Showalter, my reading raised some questions I didn't know how to answer about the autonomy of a women's literary tradition, but I felt sure that there would be an audience for my book. And the writers themselves kept me going as I read their hopes and all their struggles and failures that would make a difference to the women who came after. They gave me the confidence to believe that even if I were not Northrop Fye's sister, the great feminist critic who would get everything right, it was enough to find the courage to write exactly what I thought and to be willing to share my own struggles and errors in the faith that the critics who came after me would know more and do better. Now the next question is, how did this phrase, a literature of their own, come to be? And Showalter comes up with an incident, and she says that the Princeton University Press's title committee, they changed my working title from the female tradition in the English novel to a literature of their own, a phrase they took from a statement by J.S. Mill, whom I quote on the first page in the third sentence of the book. And that is, if women lived in a different country from men and had never read any of their writings, they would have a literature of their own. Next question would be that why have you been accused of not showing Virginia Woolf enough respect? And Showalter answers this like the phrase of their own or of our own in the titles of feminist scholarly and popular books have certainly had quite a vogue in the past 20 years. But almost all reviewers of the book ignored my reference to Mill. They interpreted the title as a reference to Virginia Woolf, whom some thought I had treated with insufficient reverence. Toril Moy perceived hidden motives of appropriation and rejection, and she says a distinguished feminist critic like Elaine Showalter, for example, signals her subtle swerve away from Virginia Woolf by taking over yet changing Woolf's title. Under Showalter's pen, a room of one's own becomes a literature of their own, as if she wished to indicate her problematic distance from the tradition of women writers. She lovingly uncovers in her book. The next question is, how do you want people to interpret your work? And Showalter answers is, in the 1990s, criticism of women's writing has to take the fullest possible account of the whole network of literary forces in which each text is enmeshed, and my hypothetical more of the claim of female literary influence needs to be understood as a historically specific strategy rather than a dogmatic absolute. The eve of a new century seems like the ideal time for stock taking, and the prospect of a new edition of literature of their own gives me the opportunity to reflect on what has taken place and how I would want to change the book if I were writing it now. And that's it about the interview. As readers, we are undoubtedly pleased by the Showalter's attempt in a literature of their own to spark readers' attention in illustrious female authors who have been mostly ignored in the canon of British literature. The book's enduring quality comes from the variety of obscure writers it makes references to, not from her comments on Bronte, George Eliot or Virginia Woolf. In fact, Showalter's work is a form of a rediscovering that maps out the landscape of women's writing broadly rather than in depth. She has established a tradition for women writers, as the title of her book suggests. The book can be seen as the birth of feminist criticism. Regardless of the book's shortcomings, we owe it a great deal. So I believe that you would have loved this analysis on Elaine Showalter's text.